Writing and letters. What do we use more every day than writing, letters, words? One of the first things that you hear when you're a child is the idea of once upon a time, and it's been an English stock phrase since 1390. Other languages have different variations. In Arabic, once upon a time is said, there was, or there wasn't, oh, what a time there was, in the oldest of days and ages and times. In Chinese, they say, a very, very long time ago, and in Latin, at that time. And my favorite is Luxembourgeois, which I did not realize was a language. It was once. And what was once? Language began. Now, if you were at my lecture last week, you became friends with Homo ergaster up there from a few million years ago, and he was the first guy to use voice to develop the vocal cords that were necessary to make humans speak. And from that time on, language progressed as it does, and you see people telling their stories around campfires. That's how they really spoke and shared their cultural history. And we began to see the beginning of writing in cave paintings. But when you think of caveman writings and the evolution of writing, you think, oh, there's a caveman with a chisel and a stone. That is not at all how writing began. But before writing, there had to be language. And language is one of those things that people love to have myths about. Almost every single culture has had an origin myth of language. Of course, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's the Tower of Babel or Babel, and language came about because of discord, because God didn't want people to be able to make this tower. So by the time they got to a very tall point, he made them all just instantly speak different languages. And it just happened magically that way. The Indian tradition is really interesting. There was the World Tree of Knowledge, which I have a picture of up here. And it was really interesting because their god, Brahma, was very jealous of this tree. It had all of the knowledge of the world. So to punish it, he took all of the branches off, and every single branch he planted in a different place, and each branch turned into a different form of language. And one of the more interesting language originists was the Bantu tribe in Africa. They said that there was this terrible famine a very, very long time ago, and people were so hungry that they started just saying crazy things. And then they went off to go find food, and they kept saying those crazy things, and those crazy things developed into language. That's my absolute favorite language creation myth. Language evolved naturally based on the archaeological record, but you also look at writing, and writing has taken a very different turn from language. There are three competing clauses as to where writing actually originated. There's China, Sumeria, and Egypt, and each of the cultures vehemently believes that they are the ones that invented writing, but we have a little bit more information than they do. China has a strong case. 8,600 years ago, 8,600 years ago, this turtle shell was made. Now you might think, wait, it's a turtle shell. Okay, how is that language? You see that little thing right there? They seem to think that that was a proto-version of their language. And it conceivably could have been a proto-version. An interesting fact is I was looking up this, and one of the BU, Boston University professors, commented on this, saying that it was complete malarkey, saying it might have been a proto-version, but it also could have been just decoration. But what is really interesting is that it was discovered in 1962, and the markings relate to the Oracle bone script that became super popular. But it became super popular in 2000 BCE. So there's this nice little gap of 5,000–6,000 years that we have nothing from. Which leads most people to think, well, if it was language developing, you wouldn't just have one single object and then it completely die out right away. That wouldn't happen. So we have another land. We have hieroglyphics from the Egyptians. They also have a very strong case, from 4000 BCE. Now, Egyptian hieroglyphics can't be directly correlated to the alphabet in the way that different languages can. It's a whole different format. The interpretations depend whether they were literal representations of the animal or an ideogram, which is an idea represented by a picture. And the problem with ancient Egyptian is they used both. They just used what they felt like. And most hieroglyphics were phonetic, like if there was a picture of an eye, that meant eye and the sound eye. But it also could mean literally an eyeball. So it's extremely hard to translate ancient Egyptian. A really interesting thing is they also didn't normally incorporate vowels. if you look on some different people that try to make, I know I've done this before, you get your name written in ancient Egyptian, and it's very fun, but you look at it and it's like, well, that's my name. No, it's not. They didn't use vowels. And we all have vowels in our names. So generally, you want to have some sort of understanding. The E sound could be represented by 5 different symbols, and it wasn't even a vowel, it was just a sound, because they didn't have vowels. So the last letter of my name, Haley, is a Y. I've seen it represented by an iris, I've seen it represented by 2 reeds, 1 reed, a staff. Basically, the companies that try to sell you ancient Egyptian things are just going because it looks pretty, not because that's actually what your name is. Ancient Egyptian was also really interesting because you could read it any way you wanted to. You could read it right to left, you could read it left to right, you could read it up to down, and the way to tell what way you were supposed to read it was you had to look which way the human figures were facing. If a human figure was facing this way, you read it right to left. If it was facing this way, left to right. And that was the entire case, and we don't have any other language that does something quite as crazy as that. The Egyptians were also tricky in that they liked to use redundant letters to make things look prettier. Egyptian aesthetics were very, very important, so they would completely misspell words just to make them look prettier. They also used redundancies in biliteral and triliteral symbols for aesthetic reasons, which biliteral is a symbol that has 2 sounds attached to it, and they would use those 2 sounds and then one of those 2 sounds again to make it look prettier. And triliteral is the same, so they could just put even more characters in. They also used logograms, which are symbols that mean exactly what they're painted. And that is probably why it took so very long to decipher ancient Egyptian, which we would not have been able to do without the Rosetta Stone.
Is there anything in the record indicating what percentage of their society were actually literate?
Oh, it was basically only scribes. The kings were basically illiterate. There were a few learned people, but probably 99% of people were scribes.
So,
no one could read anything.
Among their subgroup, even if you had just these basic rules of how to read this, they're writing to each other scribes and essentially to the gods.
They were writing for the gods and for the temples. There weren't any letters like, "Dear Mom, I miss you." You didn't send letters like that. It was all, the god smiled upon the pharaoh and the pharaoh went to heaven. It was nothing, they had a language, but it was all a verbal language. Now we come to Sumeria, who pretty much has the best claim on terms of language. These are Bule or Bola. There are 5,000 different ways to pronounce this correctly. And these are from 8,000 BC. And you look at them and they're like, oh, they're little rocks with stuff on them. These are actually counting tokens, and you notice they're all in different shapes. Each of these shapes meant something different. They were used for record keeping, which is how writing originated. You think that writing would originate because you want to write down your history, you want to write down something that happened or an important event. It was all for taxes and tribute. That's why writing was invented. In the Uruk period in Assyria, they invented this version where they would make these little coins. And they would also make these tiny little containers. And they would use the coins to imprint on the little container while they were drawing what type of coin was inside. And about 100 or so years later, they realized this is completely silly. Why are we imprinting it on the outside and then putting the coins inside? So then they switched just to writing on the outside of it, and they made a bunch of different little bullae that they just imprinted but didn't put inside. And that way it saved on clay, saved on time. The tokens themselves had no value, and that was the change in writing. The tokens had no value, it was the picture of the tokens that had value, that represented what was inside. And that was representational writing's beginnings. Writing really began in Sumeria, and I just want you guys to look at this one for a bit. I like this picture a whole heck of a lot because it shows writing is far from stagnant. You see the difference between 3200 BCE and 1000 BCE, and you see the changes that writing has undergone. And the important thing is you see these logographic pictures, where it's a picture of a head, it means head. It's a picture of a foot, it means to walk. Things like that. And you see how throughout time they've changed and they've become stylized.